A lone ship drifts through the fog toward the Sicilian coast. Its sails hang torn, its deck silent. The townsfolk watch from the harbor, calling out, but no one answers. When they finally board, they find only bodies. Some still at their posts, eyes open, skin darkened with strange black sores. No one knows it yet, but that moment, that single ghost ship in 1347, will change the course of human history. Within months, cities will fall silent. Families erased. Kingdoms without heirs. Priests will refuse the dead, and kings will flee from their own people. They will call it the Great Mortality, the Black Death. But what if this plague wasn't just destruction? What if it was transformation? Because from the ashes of this catastrophe, from the silence of empty villages and the grief of millions, something unexpected will emerge. Art, science, rebellion, and rebirth. This isn't just a story about death. It's the story of how death created the modern world. This is how the Black Death changed the world, forever. In the middle of the 14th century, the world was smaller, slower, and utterly unprepared. Europe was rising, its cathedrals piercing the heavens, its cities growing rich from trade along the Silk Road. Kings ruled with divine authority, the Church promised salvation, and the people believed that God's hand governed all things, from the harvest to their fate. But beneath this fragile order, the world was already trembling. Trade routes connected distant lands, but they also carried invisible passengers, fleas, rats, bacteria, and in one fateful year, 1347, those passengers arrived. No one had words for what they were seeing. People died faster than bodies could be buried. A cough in the morning, a grave by nightfall. Doctors wore long bird-like masks filled with herbs to cleanse the air. Priests wandered through empty streets, whispering prayers to no one left alive. In some cities, half the population vanished within weeks. In others, entire villages ceased to exist, doors left open, food still on the table, dogs crying beside their owners' beds. The people of the Middle Ages thought the end of the world had come. But in truth, it was only the end of the old world. Because from this chaos, this unimaginable suffering, the world would shift in ways no one could foresee. The Black Death would tear through every layer of medieval life: faith, power, economy, and art. It would shatter the illusion of divine order and force humanity to look inward for meaning. The farmer, once a servant, would demand wages. The scholar, once bound by dogma, would question the heavens. The artist, haunted by death, would begin to paint life with a new kind of honesty. What began as a wave of death would ignite the greatest transformation in human history. Without the Black Death, there would be no Renaissance, no scientific revolution, no modern medicine, no concept of individual freedom as we know it. This isn't just a story about a plague. It's about how a single, microscopic force reset civilization, reshaping everything from labor and art to faith and power. And in its shadow, we'll find a mirror, because every pandemic since, from smallpox to COVID-19, has echoed the same questions born in 1348. What does humanity learn from catastrophe? And when everything falls apart, what rises from the ruins? As we step into the heart of the 14th century, we enter not just an age of despair, but the birthplace of the modern world. 1. The silent arrival, the day death came ashore. It began far from Europe, in the mountains and steppes of Central Asia. Long before anyone in Europe had heard of the Black Death, it was already moving quietly, invisibly, along the arteries of the known world. Caravans carried silk and spices from China to the Mediterranean, and with them, stowaways. Fleas clinging to the fur of black rat. Inside those fleas, a microscopic killer, Yersinia pestis. A single bite was enough to set a chain reaction in motion that would engulf continents. By the 1340s, the Mongol Empire had connected east and west more than ever before. But with connection came consequence. At the bustling ports of the Black Sea, in places like Kaffa, a Genoese trading outpost, merchants and soldiers mingled with travelers from every corner of Eurasia. It was there, historians believe, that the invisible enemy made its final leap toward Europe. The story goes that during the siege of Kaffa, Mongol forces, struck by the plague, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, a primitive act of biological warfare. Terrified, the traders fled by sea, desperate to escape. But they carried with them more than cargo. They carried death itself. In October 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships appeared off the coast of Sicily. Their arrival should have been routine, the return of merchants laden with goods and stories from the east. But something was wrong. The sailors aboard were dying. Some were already dead. And as the ships anchored, rats scurried down the mooring ropes, vanishing into the alleys and granaries of Messina. At first, no one understood. The bodies showed strange black swellings, buboes, they called them, on the neck, armpits, and groin. The skin turned dark, the blood thickened, the mind clouded. Victims screamed in fevered delirium and died within days. Panic spread faster than the disease. The Sicilian authorities tried to drive the ships away, but it was too late. Within days, the plague was everywhere. Messina fell silent. From Sicily, the ships sailed north, to Genoa, to Venice, to Marseille, each port becoming another gateway of infection. In less than a year, the plague had crossed Europe's borders like an unstoppable tide. Imagine it. Merchants collapsing in the marketplaces of Florence, priests giving last rites to dozens a day, doctors powerless before an invisible foe. The air itself was thought to be poisoned, miasma, they called it, so people burned herbs, carried flowers, and sealed their doors with wax. But no prayer, no potion, no science of the age could stop it. In the east, cities like Constantinople fell in week. In the west, London's bells tolled endlessly, the sound of loss echoing through empty streets. In France, Pope Clement VI ordered massive fires to burn day and night, hoping the smoke would cleanse the air. In Germany, entire towns shut themselves off. Some burned their gates, believing isolation could keep the pestilence out. But the Black Death was already inside. Inside ship. Inside walls. Inside bodies. By the time Europe realized what it was facing, the disease was already winning. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, something remarkable happened. For the first time, people began to question why. Was this God's punishment? A curse? Or something natural, something that could be understood? That question, whispered in fear by medieval doctors and priests, would become the spark that ignited centuries of human curiosity. The Black Death had arrived silently, but the echoes of its arrival would thunder across time. 2. Anatomy of a killer, the science behind the PLU. They called it the pestilence. To the people of the 14th century, it seemed alive, as if the air itself had turned against them. They couldn't see it, but they could feel it everywhere. In the chill of the wind, the rot in the streets, the silence of churches filled with the scent of death. Doctors believed the disease came from corrupted air. Astrologers claimed the planets had aligned in an evil pattern. The Church saw divine punishment, the wrath of God upon a sinful world. No one imagined that the true killer was something so small that it would take centuries to see it. Today we know its name, Yersinia pestis, a microscopic bacterium carried in the blood of fleas that lived on rat. When an infected flea bit a human, the bacteria entered the bloodstream and multiplied with ferocious speed. Within hours, the victim's lymph nodes swelled painfully. Within days, their body turned against itself. Fever, vomiting, delirium, and finally the blackening of the skin. Hence the name, the Black Death. Most victims died within 3 to 5 days. Those who didn't often carried the infection to others. Every cough, every touch, every breath could spread it further. But this plague wasn't one single disease. It came in 3 forms, each more terrifying than the last. The bubonic plague attacked the lymphatic system, causing those swollen buboes. The septicemic plague invaded the blood, turning flesh black and cold within hours. And the pneumonic plague, the most lethal of all, infected the lungs, spreading from person to person through the air. It was the perfect killer, and the world, for all its faith and superstition, had no defense. What makes this story even darker is how the Black Death evolved. For centuries, historians thought it vanished after the 14th century. But modern science tells a different tale. DNA extracted from medieval graves shows that Yersinia pestis never truly disappeared. It adapted, mutated, and continued to reappear across the world in waves. It resurfaced in London in the 1600s, in Asia in the 1800s, and even today, its descendants still exist in remote corners of the globe. The Black Death wasn't a single event. It was a genetic turning point, one that changed us. Studies show that survivors of the plague passed on genes that made their descendants more resistant to disease. In a sense, the plague rewrote human biology, an invisible inheritance born from suffering. And yet, the people of the 14th century could not see this. All they saw were signs and omens. A dog howling before dawn. A comet in the night sky. A sudden silence after prayer. They searched for meaning, not microbes. They sought salvation, not science. But the unanswered question, what is this thing killing us? Planted a seed that would grow centuries later into the birth of modern medicine. The plague was the enemy humanity couldn't name, and in trying to name it, people would begin to change how they saw the world itself. 3. The collapse, society unravels. By 1348, Europe was a continent in free fall. The plague didn't simply kill bodies, it dismantled the entire structure of civilization. There was no government strong enough, no faith unshaken, no wall high enough to contain it. Cities that had stood for centuries crumbled within months. Florence, once a jewel of trade and art, was turned into a graveyard. Chroniclers wrote of streets littered with corpses, of men and women dying alone in their houses, of neighbors too afraid to knock on each other's doors. The father abandons his child, one witness wrote. The wife her husband. The brother his brother. The bonds that held society together, family, community, faith, dissolved under the weight of fear. The rich fled to the countryside, hiding in their manors, believing that isolation could save them. The poor, left behind, turned to desperation. Thieves looted homes and bodies alike. Abandoned churches were stripped of gold. In Paris, carts creaked through the streets each morning, collecting the dead. Burial grounds overflowed. In London, they dug trenches wide enough to swallow hundreds. In Avignon, bodies were stacked in the river when the cemeteries could take no more. And yet, even in this horror, the human spirit refused to vanish. Some turned to wild faith. The flagellants, men who roamed from town to town whipping themselves in public squares, begging God for mercy. Others turned to denial, holding feasts, drinking, dancing among the dead, whispering, "Eat, drink, for tomorrow we die." But beneath the chaos, something unexpected began to stir. As priests and nobles fell like everyone else, the illusion of divine hierarchy began to crack. The people started to ask, if the king can die, if the bishop can die, if even the pope hides behind walls of fire, are they truly closer to God than us? For the first time in centuries, peasants and townsfolk began to see themselves not as helpless subjects, but as survivors, indispensable, powerful in their labor. Fields lay empty, farms abandoned, and when the plague began to fade, landowners returned to find there were no workers left. Those who survived were suddenly in demand. Wages rose. Laborers demanded pay, not servitude. Entire estates fell apart because no one would till the soil for free. This was the unintentional revolution. The plague had not only destroyed the old order, it had made a new one possible. In England, this new tension would boil into open revolt, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when men who had once bowed their heads before lords now shouted for freedom and justice. Across Europe, feudalism, the centuries-old system of masters and serfs, began to crumble, not through war or decree, but through the quiet force of necessity. The Black Death, in its merciless destruction, had leveled the playing field of humanity. It made kings and beggars equal in death, and that equality began to echo in life. No one planned a revolution, but when half of Europe disappeared, the survivors had no choice but to rebuild, and this time, they would rebuild on their own terms. The world was changing, even as the dying bells still rang. And in the ashes of collapse, humanity began, unknowingly, to rise. 4. Faith in crisis, God's silence and the birth of doubt. For 1,000 years, Europe had lived under the shadow of divine order. Every life, every death, every storm was believed to be the will of God. The Church was the bridge between heaven and earth, the shepherd of souls, the keeper of truth. But the plague tore that bridge apart. When prayers went unanswered, when priests fell beside peasants, when holy water failed to cleanse the dying, faith began to tremble. People looked to the heavens for answers and found only silence. In city after city, monasteries emptied. Entire convents disappeared. In some places, half the clergy perished, leaving churches abandoned and the people leaderless. Those who survived were often accused of cowardice, fleeing instead of healing. The sacred had become frail, human, fallible, and afraid. For many, this silence was unbearable. If God was merciful, why such suffering? If he was just, why such cruelty? The old certainties, that prayer protected, that sin caused sickness, that salvation was assured, no longer fit the world they saw. Some turned to superstition. Others turned to rage. Rumors spread like the plague itself. Whispers that the disease had been caused by outsiders, heretics, or Jews poisoning wells. Across Europe, waves of violence erupted. Entire Jewish communities were massacred, burned alive, driven from cities they had lived in for generations. Humanity's fear needed an answer, and when heaven was silent, it looked for monsters among men. But even amid this darkness, a quiet awakening was taking root. A few began to question not God, but the way humans interpreted him. Maybe the Church did not hold all truth. Maybe the cosmos was not ruled by divine anger, but by natural laws waiting to be understood. Maybe salvation wasn't found in the next world, but in making this one better. From despair came curiosity. From doubt came reason. In Florence, scholars like Petrarch began to read the works of ancient thinkers, Aristotle, Cicero, Galen, long dismissed by the Church as pagan. They searched the past for wisdom the present could no longer provide. In Paris, physicians began to dissect corpses in secret, seeking the physical truth of disease. In Oxford, friars started to question whether observation, not scripture, was the true path to knowledge. It was blasphemy to some, revelation to others. The Black Death, without intention, had broken the mental chains of the Middle Ages. When faith failed, thinking began. Not as rebellion, but as survival. The idea that truth could be discovered, not just delivered, that man could study creation and understand it, was born from this silence. And though centuries would pass before it matured into the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, its roots lay here, in the moment when God stopped answering. The plague didn't destroy belief. It transformed it. It forced faith to evolve, to shift from blind devotion to questioning, from fear to understanding. For the first time, humanity looked inward and asked not, "What have we done to deserve this?" But, how does the world truly work? That question, whispered amid graves and prayers, would ignite the birth of modern thought. The Black Death had killed millions, but it also awakened the most powerful force on Earth, the human mind. 5. The birth of the modern world, art, labor, and power reimagined. When the plague's shadow finally began to fade, Europe was unrecognizable. The world that rose from its ruins was not the same world that had fallen. The population had been cut in half, whole families erased, entire villages vanished. But in that emptiness lay something unexpected, possibility. For centuries, the poor had served the rich, bound by laws and customs older than memory. But now there were too few workers, too few farmers, too few hands to feed the living. The survivors found themselves, for the first time, in demand. A plowman who had once worked for scraps could now demand wages. A craftsman could move to another town and sell his skills freely. The old feudal order, where lords owned land and lives alike, began to fracture. In England, Parliament tried to fight back. The Statute of Labourers was passed in 1351, forbidding peasants from asking for higher pay. But the law couldn't fight necessity. The peasants knew their worth. They had buried their masters, seen the weakness of kings, and realized that without them, nothing worked. In 1381, their anger erupted. Thousands of peasants marched on London, demanding freedom, fair wages, and an end to feudal oppression. The revolt was crushed, but the idea could not be buried. For the first time, the common people had glimpsed the possibility of equality. Elsewhere, the same transformation was taking root. Merchants and traders, surviving where nobles had fallen, grew powerful. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Bruges became centers of wealth and innovation. A new class emerged, the bourgeoisie, neither noble nor peasant, but something entirely new, citizens who could shape their own destiny through trade, art, and intellect. From tragedy, the seeds of capitalism began to sprout. From the collapse of divine hierarchy rose the idea of individual worth. And as society changed, so did art. Before the plague, medieval art was devoted to heaven. Saints, angels, and icons, painted in rigid formality. But after the plague, artists began to paint the world as it was. Painters like Giotto and later Bruegel captured human faces in grief and joy, not symbols but souls. The fragility of life became the subject of art. Skulls, hourglasses, and wilting flowers appeared in paintings, reminders that time was fleeting, that beauty lived in mortality. Even architecture changed. Cathedrals grew less like fortresses of faith and more like open spaces of light, reflections of human aspiration rather than divine fear. In Florence, the banker's son Cosimo de' Medici poured his fortune into art and knowledge, funding thinkers and builders who would spark the Renaissance. A sculptor named Donatello rediscovered the human body as a form of divine beauty. A painter named Masaccio experimented with light and shadow, giving depth to his figures. Depth not just of space, but of soul. This was more than aesthetic evolution. It was a philosophical revolution. For the first time in centuries, humans were not painting heaven, they were painting themselves. And behind that art was a new kind of thought, humanism. A belief that man, not just God, had power, the power to reason, to create, to change. Medicine, too, began to shift. After the plague, physicians grew skeptical of superstition. They studied anatomy, recorded symptoms, and observed patterns. Hospitals became places of care, not merely prayer. Slowly, the idea emerged that disease had natural causes, and that understanding nature was the key to mastering it. Even time itself changed. Before the plague, time was measured by the church, by bells, prayers, and holy days. After, merchants began measuring it by trade, contracts, and productivity. Time became a currency, one of the first signs of the modern age. What had begun as apocalypse had become acceleration. Europe was now reinventing itself at a speed never seen before, socially, economically, intellectually. The Black Death had destroyed half of humanity, and in doing so, it had cleared the ground for a new one to emerge. The medieval world died in agony. But in that death, humanity rediscovered life, not eternal life promised in heaven, but the fragile, burning brilliance of life on earth. 6. Echoes through time, the plague's hidden legacy. Centuries passed. The world rebuilt. But the Black Death never really left us. Its ghosts linger in our cities, in our science, in our very DNA. The plague didn't just rewrite history, it rewired humanity. In the centuries that followed, waves of plague returned again and again. London in 1665. Marseille in 1720. India and China in the 19th century. Each outbreak smaller than the last, yet each one a reminder that the line between life and extinction is thinner than we like to think. The difference now was knowledge. The world had learned to fight back. When the Black Death first struck, people turned to prayer, superstition, and blame. But by the time of later outbreaks, humanity had changed. We had microscopes, quarantines, city boards of health. The word quarantine itself was born from this legacy. From the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days, the period ships were forced to wait before docking in Venice. From those desperate measures grew modern public health. The idea that society could fight disease through science, not sacrifice. Even our cities bear the plague's fingerprint. When so many died, the living rebuilt with new purpose. Wider streets, cleaner water systems, open squares for air to circulate. Urban planning, sanitation, and the foundations of modern medicine all trace their lineage to the lessons of the 14th century. And beyond the physical world, the plague transformed how humans thought about mortality. Before the Black Death, death was a distant theology, an event governed by faith. Afterward, it became deeply personal. The dance of death, a macabre motif of skeletons leading kings and beggars alike, filled art and literature. But behind the horror was a new kind of honesty, an acknowledgement that life was fragile, equal, and precious. That awareness shaped everything, from Renaissance philosophy to modern psychology. It taught humanity to find beauty in impermanence, to seek meaning in the moment. Even economics bears its shadow. The labor shortages that followed the plague reshaped global systems. Feudalism gave way to wage labor, then to trade capitalism, and eventually to industrialization. Without the collapse of the medieval order, there might never have been a middle class. No merchants, no innovation, no consumer revolutions. The plague's reach extends further than Europe, too. In Asia, similar outbreaks destabilized empires and shifted power balances. In the Middle East, scholars and doctors documented symptoms, experimented with quarantine, and passed that knowledge westward, laying the groundwork for modern epidemiology. It was, in every sense, a global event before globalization even had a name. And then there's the legacy written not in ink or architecture, but in our genes. Modern genetic studies show that survivors of the plague passed on mutations that helped resist infection. Those same genes still live in us today, shaping immune responses, influencing disease resistance, even affecting inflammation and aging. In a strange twist of evolution, the Black Death sculpted the human body itself. We are, quite literally, descendants of survivors. Every heartbeat that continues today carries the echo of those who lived through history's darkest hours. And that echo still guides us. When modern pandemics strike, when fear fills the air and uncertainty grips the world, we return to the same questions asked in 1348. How do we survive? What will change when it's over? And what will we become because of it? The plague taught humanity an eternal truth, that crisis is both destruction and creation. Every collapse forces reinvention. Every ending hides a beginning. When we build vaccines, when we organize quarantines, when we debate freedom and safety, we are reenacting decisions first made by terrified people in plague-ridden cities nearly 700 years ago. The Black Death may have ended in numbers, but it never ended in influence. It changed how we govern, how we love, how we grieve, how we hope. It changed what it means to be human. The turning point of humanity. By 1353, the plague had burned through Europe like a storm that had no mercy left to give. Half the continent lay silent. Entire generations were gone, names erased, lineages broken, languages dying with the last breath of their speakers. But in the stillness that followed, something extraordinary began to happen. Out of the graves came questions, whispered at first, then spoken aloud. If the world can end so easily, what does that say about God's plan? About power? About the worth of a single life? Those questions were dangerous. Yet they were also liberating. In England, a peasant looked at the field he once plowed for another man and thought, "Why should I bow to anyone?" In Italy, a scholar opened an ancient text and wondered, what if reason is also divine? In Flanders, an artist mixed pigment with tears and painted not saints, but neighbors, flawed, human, alive. A silent revolution had begun, not of armies, but of ideas. For centuries, the Church and the Crown had told people that truth flowed downward, from heaven to priests, from kings to peasants. But the plague had shattered that illusion. It showed that even popes could die, that the richest palaces could fall as easily as the poorest hut. And when everything sacred proved mortal, the world discovered something far more powerful than dogma, the self. Humanity, for the first time, began to believe in its own hand. It started with small acts of defiance. A craftsman signing his name on a painting, a physician writing down observations instead of prayers, a philosopher asking why instead of who. Each act was a spark, tiny, almost invisible, but together they set fire to the future. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, all would trace their roots back to this moment when despair turned into curiosity, when fear became reason, when loss became creation. The Black Death was never just a tragedy. It was a transformation, a brutal, painful metamorphosis that forced humanity to confront its own potential. Death had tried to erase the world, and in resisting it, people found their purpose. The painter found beauty in impermanence. The thinker found truth in questioning. The survivor found strength in rebuilding. This was the true turning point, when humanity looked into the abyss and, instead of falling, stepped forward. Because every civilization, at some moment, faces its plague, its breaking, its reckoning. But the story of the 14th century tells us something timeless, that destruction does not end history, it drives it. The Black Death destroyed a world built on obedience and gave birth to one built on imagination. It silenced faith, and in that silence, humanity heard its own voice for the first time. The world that emerged was raw, fragile, and uncertain, but it was awake. The plague, in its fury, tried to kill life. Instead, it gave it meaning. The Black Death ended centuries ago, but its echoes have never stopped. They linger in our medicine, our cities, our science, and in the quiet awareness that everything we build can vanish overnight. But maybe that's its greatest legacy. Because through that darkness, humanity learned what it truly is. Fragile, yes, but also relentless. Capable of rebuilding, reinventing, enduring. Every generation faces its own version of the plague, a trial that strips away illusions and forces us to see what remains. For some, it's war. For others, disease. Yet every time, the pattern repeats. Fear, loss, and then creation. The people of the 14th century didn't survive because they were stronger than death. They survived because, even surrounded by despair, they kept imagining a future. They painted. They wrote. They built. They chose to live as if life still mattered. And that choice, repeated by millions of nameless souls, changed everything. We are their inheritance. Their defiance runs in our veins, their lessons in our mind. Every act of healing, every piece of art, every discovery that pushes back the dark, all of it traces back to that moment when the world nearly ended and refused to. The Black Death was humanity's darkest hour. But it was also proof that even in ruin there is rebirth. Death, in trying to erase us, gave us the greatest gift of all, the understanding that life, no matter how brief, is worth everything.